This is a true story that is widely known in my village. People in the village still refer to this story as a haunting horror experience to this day. A long time ago, a wealthy family in my village reconstructed a dowry house. When it was completed, the owner of the house lavished the villagers with a big party. The party went on until the middle of the night. Everyone drank a lot until they blushed as they walked out. Following the departure of the guests, the residents of the house began to clean and rest in the new home. But in the middle of the night, while lying on the newly constructed bed, the owner felt extremely uneasy. He kept tossing and turning all night, unable to sleep, and then experienced severe stomach pain, cold and shivering all over his body. When he couldn't take it any longer, he turned to call his wife, who was lying next to him, to check on him. But he called again and again. His wife did not answer, so he went off to bed alone and checked the house's fireplace. As soon as he set his foot on the brick floor, his entire body became cold with such an unpleasant chill. He took a few steps, felt uneasy and looked back with trepidation. When he looked at the bed, he found himself lying motionlessly there. His entire face was white, his eyes wide open as if he was a corpse. He was terrified by the scene. He mumbled a few sentences, pointed to his own body, shivered, then held. He took a step back, seeing himself lying on the bed, but appearing to be placed on a coffin. He fainted out of fear, and gloomy darkness enveloped the space in front of his eyes. The wife awoke the next morning to prepare breakfast as usual. She waited for so long, but her husband never came out for breakfast. She entered the room to check. However, when she arrived, her husband's body was cold, but his pulse was still present, albeit weakly. She and her children rushed her husband to the hospital for an examination. However, no doctor was able to diagnose his illness. Her family agreed to let him stay in the hospital for an extended period of time, but there was no progress, so they returned him home in pain. At the hospital, his grandson stood behind his mother, concernedly looking at him. The house's owner at this time was in a coma, looking exactly like he had died. The whole face had begun to turn grey because of lack of breath. His son took his wife and children home to seek for treatment after completing the procedure at the hospital. Everyone in the house had been worriedly waiting beside his bed all night. Because the grandson needed to go to the toilet late at night, he took a flashlight and went out to the toilet alone. But as soon as he got to the door, a strange noise came from behind the child, like a large animal breathing. He turned his head towards the noise and noticed a figure twice the size of an adult slowly walking into the courtyard. That piqued the boy's interest, and he crouched silently behind him, watching this colossal monstrosity himself. The monstrosity rushed in front of the boy, dragging an iron chain on the ground, resounding throughout the yard. The boy assumed that was a thief in his house, so he recklessly approached and asked loudly who he was. But he didn't seem to hear his voice, and he went straight to the owner's room window. The boy went to the door, shouted loudly, and called his parents for help because he was afraid the giant would harm his grandfather. But as he moved forward, the giant's face appeared, clearly in the light, revealing the form of a long-tongued demon. His cheekbones protruded, and he slowly turned his face to look at him, showing his long tongue, which was long enough to touch the ground and threaten the poor boy. The scene caused him to panic and scream. His parents became terrified too when they heard his screams outside. The two dashed out to find him and discovered him sitting on the ground in front of the door to the grandpa's room. When his parents saw this, they immediately came over and helped him up. The two immediately inquired as to what had just happened. The boy cried out and pointed forward, claiming to have encountered a demon. Then he described the entire appearance of the demon he had encountered. At first, his parents didn't believe him. However, because of his tenacity, the two hesitated. His mother appeared to have recognized the problem and immediately advised her husband to invite a good shaman in the village to come over. The house's owner's son invited a shaman that night. This was my village's most well-known one. As soon as he walked into the house, he went to the owner's bed and took his pulse to check on his situation. After checking his pulse, he sighed and stated that the house's owner had a strange disease that he had never seen before. When her daughter-in-law heard it, she burst into tears, worrying that he would never wake up again. The shaman couldn't ignore after seeing it, but he needed more time to figure out what was causing it. He stood up and walked around, his hands clasped behind his back. A pensive and tense expression appeared on his face. Suddenly he turned to look at the man's bed, and his face changed color, revealing surprise. He was serious when he asked the daughter-in-law to find him a tape measure. He took it and carefully measured around the owner's bed. Nobody knew what he aimed for. He was measuring and calculating solemnly by pressing his knuckles. Then his face revealed a mixture of surprise and concern. He looked up at the daughter-in-law who was standing in front of him and asked her who built and designed this bed. The daughter-in-law attempted to recall and confirm with the shaman that this bed was designed by a builder. Later, the daughter-in-law added that her father and the builder had a falling out while the house was being constructed. Her father assaulted the builder, injuring him, and deducted a week's wages from him. The shaman immediately recognized the root of the problem after hearing the story. He was enraged, yelling at the builder for being a jerk. He pointed to the bed and told everyone in the house to dismantle it as soon as possible because it was actually a coffin. Everyone in the family initially didn't believe it, but when they double-checked it, everyone was shocked and had to admit it. The shaman then explained that in order to exact revenge on the owner, the builder purposefully fashioned his bed in the shape of a coffin and imprisoned the owner's soul within it. The homeowner's son and a few neighbors used a hammer to break the bed, as instructed by the shaman. Every brick had been broken and was scattered everywhere, with dust flying. After a while, the cement and sand bricks that served as the bed's background appeared, along with a paper doll in the center. The landlord's son and the shaman picked up the doll, and the owner's full name was written on the back. The shaman then prepared a cup of tonic for the host, which he carefully served to him. After half an hour of taking the medicine, the host moved slowly opening his eyes, as if he had just awoken. He opened his eyes and looked up at everyone in the house, his face worried and scared, as if he had just woken up from a nightmare. Despite the treatment, the owner's spirit was not much better as a result of a neurological complication, becoming a famous story in the village, and the builder also met with disaster later. It happened in 1996 in a small city in Hong Kong. This story was also a famous strange case at that time. Mr. Ma was a security guard at an old apartment building. Evenings were always his best time. Because it was summer, the day was very hot and muggy, but the night was cooler and more pleasant. There was nothing better than sitting in the wind and drinking a glass of wine. After placing the pot of fragrant lamb stew on the table, Mr. Ma was very happy and refreshed, so he poured a glass of wine and was ready to sip. But suddenly something fell from above very quickly and directly into his mutton pot. The broth and even the lamb was splattered all over the table, which greatly annoyed Mr. Ma. He didn't know who could be so careless, blatantly throwing trash down, so he looked up and started cursing. But there was absolutely no movement above. Everything was still quiet. No one answered him. He thought they must be afraid of being scolded by Mr. Ma, so they deliberately ignored him. But just a few minutes later, from the 4th floor, something suddenly fell again, which was black and slightly round. Thinking that the other person would continue to throw trash on the ground, Mr. Ma was very attentive to what was falling to catch the other guy. However, the thing that fell was something he couldn't believe, because it was a human head. It flew from above very quickly. This thing made him panic. He had never encountered a situation like this before. The head fell straight onto the table, hitting Mr. Ma's pot of lamb, sending everything flying everywhere. He was also surprised to the point of immobilization. At this point, Mr. Ma could only watch the mess in front of him, his eyes white with fear. The head belonged to a woman. Because of blood loss, her skin had turned pale. Next to the head was a human hand, so it was clear that what had fallen before was a human hand. At this point, Mr. Ma wanted to run away, but his legs were numb. So, he backed up and fell back and still staring at the head on the table. In the end, Mr. Ma gathered all his strength to scream out loud to everyone for help. After Mr. Ma's screams, everyone gathered and called the police. The police car was present at the scene where the head fell within minutes. Hearing Mr. Ma's statement, the police began to surround the room to prepare to arrest the perpetrator. But when standing in front of the room, the policeman suddenly saw something very strange. That's the door to the room that didn't close. It's still open. Could the killer have run away? If not, he probably didn't know what fear was. However, the policemen were also very cautious. They stood by the door and peered inside the room through the half-open door. But what was inside made them suddenly startle. The strong smell of blood gushing out from inside the dark room with only a little light. A man was sitting on the sofa with a gloomy expression, surrounded by blood, stretching from the wall to his clothes to the floor. On the floor was a large knife. The type used to cut meat was also lying in a pool of blood. It seemed that this was the weapon that the man used to kill people. The policeman stood in front of him, even pointed a gun at his head to control him, but he still did not resist or explain anything. His eyes were empty and lifeless, his face dark and extremely sad. It was worth mentioning that he kept staring at the TV without blinking. Something was attracting him more than the fact that he had just killed someone. The strangest thing was that there were no programs on TV. So what was he looking at? And what made him like that? The TV continued to make squeaks, and the screen was only filled with black and white dots as if the signal was lost. The police then went looking for clues around the house. They discovered the body of a woman without a head sitting in the kitchen. This must be the body of the head that had fallen on Mr. Ma's table. Inside the bedroom was the body of a boy, about 10 years old, whose head was also beheaded, but his head was left not far away, not thrown out. Because this case shocked the people and the press, the police couldn't take it lightly. They immediately set up a team to investigate everything. The man was also taken to the police station to get a bow. His face remained the same, still wide open eyes and gloomy. After interrogation, what the police received was only a statement that the devil had made him. He did not know what he had just done. But of course, the police did not believe it. The police wanted him to tell everything because there was no such thing as being manipulated by the devil, like he said. He also began to recount everything that night. He had no reason to kill his wife and son. It was a day off for the couple, so they both took their son out to play. Then the whole family returned home just after dark. Arriving at home, everyone was tired. The wife decided to go to the kitchen to cut some fruit and bring it to the living room so that the whole family could watch TV while resting. The son went straight to the bedroom to play, and he just sat in the living room watching TV, waiting for his wife. On TV was showing a program excavating ancient tombs, was also a popular program recently. But for a while the TV suddenly blurred and the sound also started to crack. It seemed that the signal was lost. After that, the image of the other program also disappeared completely, replaced by black and white dots and shrill squeaks. But in that squeak it seemed to be a whispering voice, telling the man to kill his family and cut off their heads. And for some reason his mind went blank, and then his body began to do what the voice commanded. Just like that, he killed his family exactly the way the voice on the television said. He did not understand why he did it, but at that time he was no longer aware of anything. Hearing this, of course, the policeman would not believe it. There was no way that a strange voice coming from the TV could command someone to kill people like that. Perhaps he had a long quarrel with his wife, or he was an abuser. The investigation lasted nearly a month, but no matter what method the police used, he only gave one way, the same answer. No matter how menacing or soft-spoken the man was still the same, and he seemed to be very sure of his words. The police also reached out to neighbors and people who knew him to investigate, but according to the results, he had no reason to kill his family. Their whole family lived together very happily. Everyone knew it. But among the neighbors' testimonies, many said strange things had happened recently, since some people had unearthed an ancient tomb near this area. The people believed that perhaps it has accidentally released something bad or a curse of some kind. Of course, the police wouldn't take out those stories to write about the case because the husband himself admitted to killing his family. So he couldn't defend him for such spiritual reasons. Finally, he was sentenced to death for his cruel behavior. And whether the truth was what he told or not, no one would ever know. My elementary school teacher was a person who didn't believe in ghosts, but that year, something terrible happened that made him start to change his mind. The school I attended at the time was small in the village. In the past, the school was even more rickety and shabby, but then with donations from everyone, it was also more spacious. My teacher's name was Zhang. He was always busy and dedicated to his work. That day, he stayed at the office very late to prepare the outline for the following day. As soon as it was all over, he was able to relax his body and stretch his shoulders. Then suddenly he heard a noise coming from the window. It was like someone was walking back and forth in the schoolyard and throwing sand into the room. He listened to hear better, then noticed that the noise was getting louder and louder. The more he heard it, the more it sounded like someone was moving the sand outside. Thinking that there were still some boarding students playing outside at this hour, he slowly approached the door to have a look. Strangely, when he opened the door, there was no one outside. Everything was still extremely quiet. Muttering a few words, he went back inside. He thought, partly because he heard it wrong or just normal wind. So he quickly sat down at the table to prepare to continue working. But as soon as he sat down on the chair, the same noise started again. This time the sound was louder than before. At this point, he thought that someone was trying to make fun of him, so he went quickly and opened the door with a few scolding sentences. But it was still like at first. Everything was extremely silent outside, not even wind. Even that day the weather was hotter than usual. This thing made him start to wonder and be confused. He closed the door to go inside, but thought about the sound in his mind. But being a person who did not believe in ghosts, he still did not think much. Then he continued to sit at the table and drafted the outline for the rest. The noise was again heard outside the courtyard, this time more clearly and longer than the previous two, but he chose not to care about it anymore. Whatever it was, just didn't care. So he sat at the table and finished all his work without going out to the yard to check it out. After the work was done, it was already past midnight. There would always be boarding rooms for teachers to stay at the school. Since it was late at night and he still had to get up early tomorrow, he decided to stay in the teacher's boarding room. He also forgot that the strange noise from outside was no longer heard. He thought that someone must have known he was late and wanted to scare him, but they stopped when they got bored. At this moment, cold air rushed in from the door, surprising him, so he quickly looked out. The window was still closed, but there was a figure outside the door. Because it was too dark, the face could not be seen clearly. It seemed to be a man. That man was standing close to the window and staring at Mr. Zhang. Too surprised because suddenly at this time a stranger was standing outside the door looking at him, Mr. Zhang immediately ran to the door, thinking that the man had been teasing him by pretending to be a ghost. So Mr. Zhang was very angry. However, when he opened the door and looked at the window, the man had disappeared from time to time. Seeing that, Zhang was also confused as to what was going on. He shouted to ask if anyone was here teasing him, but everything remained silent. At this moment, he was also a little worried and felt strange. Maybe it was a ghost. Otherwise, how could it disappear so quickly? Besides, the school had never had strangers enter. But feeling that nothing happened, he quickly changed his clothes and went to bed because the following day was an important class. As soon as he lay down on the bed, Mr. Zhang began to hear the sound of sand pulling, footsteps and noise in the yard. It was louder and more chaotic than he first heard. Curious, he began to put his glasses on and listen carefully again, just afraid that he heard the wrong steps. And when he came up, there was no one like before. But the footsteps became louder and clearer. Certainly not by mistake. Mr. Zhang slowly got out of bed and put on his slippers. This time, he would be gentle, so that if someone teases, they would not be able to run in time. But when he looked out at the yard through the glass window, the things outside made him terrified. Many people were walking outside, or rather the whole yard was full of people. Suddenly in the middle of the yard, he didn't know the graves. How could it be grown so quickly? Countless graves appeared all over the schoolyard. Fearing that he might have misjudged his vision due to fatigue or because he was in a dream, he carefully took off his glasses and wiped them carefully to see again. This time, it was unmistakable. No one made fun of him at all. He must have met a ghost. The schoolyard was now littered with graves and monstrous people. Their gazes were contorted and their white eyes had no irises. Some people even looked like they had sores, which were very scary. Suddenly one of them discovered Mr. Zhang peeking from inside the room. That freaked him out. Mr. Zhang tried to cover his mouth and nose with both hands. He was afraid that even breathing lightly would be discovered by all those ghostly people. But it was too late. As soon as he covered his mouth, they also discovered him, so they turned all their attention to him. These people were so monstrous, even their heads were bent backwards as if broken. Their heads were hanging and looked terrible. After that, they gathered together and approached Mr. Zhang's room. More and more people flocked to the door of the room. They stood outside the glass door and looked inside. Only now could their faces be seen clearly. Some people had their entire faces destroyed. People had broken limbs. People had broken necks. People had blood all over their faces. The scene couldn't be more terrifying. Mr. Zhang was so scared that he fell backward. His legs were frozen, unable to move. They jostled and jostled each other, then pressed their faces to the glass as if they were watching something interesting, thinking they could rush into the room at any moment. Terrified, Mr. Zhang could only try and let out a scream when he passed out. What happened after that? Mr. Zhang didn't know anything anymore. The following morning, the other teachers came and found that Mr. Zhang had fainted on the ground, so they took him to the infirmary. He was finally able to wake up and still be at peace. After he calmed down, he also recounted everything that happened last night. After hearing the story, everyone suddenly remembered that this school was built on the land of a mass grave. There used to be a lot of strange things happening here. After that incident, the school invited a Feng Shui master to review the school, and the Feng Shui master proposed to build a large stone board in the middle of the schoolyard as a cover. And it worked. After building that stele, everything continued to go on as usual. No one was scared anymore. My village is a small piece of land with a few dozen houses, located next to a large dense forest, and a very few people come here. No one in my village knows when this forest existed, and no one dares to set foot in it. Since long time, no wild animals have appeared in this forest, only towering old trees standing side by side. However, the reason this forest has become such a dangerous obsession in my village is that no one has ever set foot in it that ever came back. Considering the story of a cousin in my family, despite the fact that he was lost in the forest and that many people in the village were looking for him, it has been a few years and there have been negative results. One day my best friend invited me to his house to watch a movie while his parents were away. We sat on the couch in the living room all night, watching horror movies. The spooky scenes created a tense atmosphere. I used to be a coward, so whenever a horror scene appeared on TV, I would jump and scream in terror. My friend Quing, seeing that I was a coward, made fun of me right away, eager to have an excuse to stay up all night tonight. I was mocked, which made me angry. I held at my two friends, attempting to demonstrate that I was not as shy as they claim. But Quing didn't think that was enough, so he took out a mid-denomination bill and placed it on the table in front of us, calling it a bet. The game would be a bet to see who dared to take a walk around my village's famous forbidden forest. Because of the aggressiveness, my other friend and I both agreed to bet. Everyone put money on the table, and whoever would win could keep all the money. We were confidently walking to the front of the jungle, unaware of the horror that was waiting for us inside. King was the game's instigator, so he volunteered to take the lead inside. I stood outside staring at his arrogant demeanor, but on the inside, I was feeling extremely uneasy. My friend and I stood huddled together to keep warm, watching Quinn rushed inside and vanished in front of us. But it wasn't long before a young man figure emerged from the forest, hurrying from the inside out, looking desperate. I asked my other friend, who was skeptical, if it was our friend Quinn. We were certain it was Quinn until the figure in the forest became clearer, but seeing his attitude at the time piqued our interest even more. Quinn ran until he couldn't breathe, as if he was being pursued by something terrifying behind him, his face still displaying his extreme fear. Quinn appeared to fall to the ground at the edge of the forest. We had to hold him with our hands before he could stand, but he mumbled something very frightening. We kept asking Quinn what happened in that forest, but it took him a long time to regain his composure and told us about what happened inside the forest. He claimed that there was a terrifying monster inside, and that as soon as he saw it, it rushed to him until out there. But when I looked back, there was no one behind Quinn, which led me to believe that he made up stories to deceive us in order to win all the bets, so we didn't believe it. It took the initiatives to venture deep into the forest, proving Quinn's claim that he was more cowardly than me. But this time Quinn repeatedly stopped me, not only refusing to let me in, but also agreed to give me all the bets if I went out. I began to feel a little uneasy in my heart at this point, but the entire forest seemed to have some kind of magic that kept urging me to go deeper inside. I took my time walking inside, carefully inspecting my surroundings. I picked up a broken wooden stick lying on the ground as a defense for myself. I took a deep breath and started to walk along the path in front of me. Despite the fact that the two sides of the forest always gave off dark and cold winds, I became intrigued by the scene inside this mysterious forest, but the deeper I went, the quieter the forest became, making me shiver. I was about to turn around at the end when I was drawn in by the rustling sound next to me. I immediately turned my head to look, and there was a strange but very large man walking towards me. This man's face and figure became more visible in the darkness right in front of me. I took a step back to protect myself, holding the wooden stick firmly in my hand just in case of the worst scenario. I kept asking who the man in front of me was, but the other person flatly refused to answer. When the mysterious person was only a few inches away, I was shocked to realize it was my family's long-lost relative. This man did not respond to my question. Instead, he showed a devilish face with 2 lines of bright red blood running down the corners of his mouth. I didn't have time to process what was going on, but the current horror moment gave me a definite answer that I had encountered a monster, just as Quinn had said earlier. This strange monster had a human-like body, but was much larger, and its legs resembled those of a wolf, complete with terrifying black sharp claws. His body was also covered in hair, and his skin sagged, as if only the outer skin covered the bones within. It reached out its hands and approached me where I was standing, as if to grab me, leaving me terrified and speechless. I could only raise the wooden stick as a weapon for self-defense. I turned my head and ran away, screaming loudly as I ran, waiting for the monster to let down its guard. But the monster in the back would not let me leave. It kept chasing me to the outside while staggered with its head as if it wanted to separate from its body. I wasn't sure what mystical power this monster had that allowed it to run so fast, but I could hear his footsteps getting closer and closer to where I was standing. He abruptly reached out and grabbed my shoulder. I could feel the cold from my body mixed with the smell of decomposing flesh, making me nauseous and scared, as if I wanted to die again and again. Because there was no other option, I turned around, used all my strength, grabbed the wooden stick and smacked the monster's head hard. My unexpected blow rendered the monster defenseless, causing it to stagger for a few seconds before immobilizing. I took advantage of the brief moment of the opportunity, sprinting towards the forest's edge in an attempt to flee. But the further I ran, the more I felt like I was lost in a maze, as this monster appeared everywhere around me. They stood everywhere, behind the towering trees, lustfully looking at me. I tried to run, and after a few steps I arrived at a safe location where I met two friends who were waiting for me. In fear, I rushed to my two friends to look for help. I told my friends that I was being pursued by monsters in the deep forest. When they saw my panicked appearance, they grabbed a nearby tree and looked into the depths of the forest. But when I and the others returned, the entire forest was empty, and I had no idea when those monsters vanished. We decided to call the cops because we were so terrified. A few minutes later, the police arrived and accompanied us to the forest to search. The cops went deep inside and discovered the wooden stick I was holding earlier, embedded in a tree right where I fought off the monster. But after searching for a long time and failing to find any more clues, we were reprimanded by the cop. He considered that we were hallucinating because we had consumed too much alcohol. Only later, I realized that this scary forest was set up to lure curious, oblivious people like me inside as prey for a scary monster. That year, around the summer of 2009, the story happened to Yang's family. He was about 8 years old at the time, and on the occasion of the holiday, Yang's family decided to return to their hometown for a few days. It was Yang's first trip out of town, and he was very excited because it was in the countryside, far from the city, and convenient for visiting his grandparents' graves. Walked a little further from the bus station through some houses to reach the grandparents' house because no one had lived there in a long time. The Yang family had to clean up as soon as they arrived. After a long day of work, it was already dark when the three of them sat around the dining table. However, Yan acted strangely during the meal. He was looking out the door and smiling while eating, which drew Yang's mother's attention. She also looked out the door, but there was no one in the yard. But Yang kept looking at the door, then talked as if he was joking with his friends. He turned his face outside and howled loudly that they should wait until he finished eating before going outside to play, which made Yang's mother felt even stranger. Yang quickly let go of his chopsticks when he'd just eaten a little bit, wanted to go out and play with his friends. Yang's mother didn't think much at the time as she thought that he was just a playful boy, so he did it on purpose to make them allow him to go out to play, and she also gently told Yang that he had just arrived here for the first time. How come he had any friends? But Yang insisted, pointing to the yard and saying that some friends were standing outside calling him out to play with them for a while already. When Yang's father heard that, he became concerned. He assumed that because he was tired from the long journey, he had become ill or developed a fever. But no matter how he explained, no one could see the three spirits outside, waving to Yang. They were also children, about Yang's age, 2 boys and 1 girl, with very happy faces but pale skin, and they were constantly inviting him to go out and play with them. Yang was just a kid, so he didn't think much about ghosts or humans when he saw friends waving at him, so he raised his hand, smiled, and waved back. At this point, Yang's parents were very concerned, looked at the door in the direction Yang waved, but they couldn't see anyone. Yang's father was worried that his son would have developed a fever, so he'd instructed his wife to check his temperature. The wife checked hastily, thinking her son was ill. But after a while, Yang's body was completely normal, with no fever or anything. Seeing this, Yang's father believed that his son was mischievous, so he asked Yang to go to bed early. He'd been traveling all day, so he obeyed his father and went to bed. Yang planned to go out tomorrow afternoon to play with her friends, so the entire family quickly cleaned up and went to bed early. Around midnight, there was a sound of children laughing and whispering outside the windows, as if they were calling someone. Yang's father was too tired today, so he didn't react. He couldn't hear the sound at all. Yang's mother, on the other hand, was more sensitive. The noise was minor, but it woke her up. The first thing Yang's mother noticed when she opened her eyes was that Yang had disappeared, and she had no idea where or when he had left the bed. Normally, when they traveled or went to strange places, Yang would also wake up his mother to take him to the toilet. She became concerned and got out of bed to go find Yang. As she passed by the window, she heard children's laughter that sounded very similar to Yang's, so Yang's mother went out to look out the window. Went to the window, looked out at the yard. She planned to open the glass windows to take a look around. However, before she could open the glass, the terrifying sight caused her to scream in terror. Yang was clearly visible at this point, sitting under a tree in the yard, playing with the ground and surrounded by 3 other children. Yang, on the other hand, sat on the ground, his hands constantly digging for something, and his expression was very strange. The mother was so terrified that she could only scream, which woke Yang's father up. The children outside in the yard heard Yang's mother's voice and turned to look at her through the window. Their eyes were white with no irises. Their mouths had a devilish smile, and Yang appeared to have missed his mother's voice. They immediately became enraged when they noticed Yang's mother standing at the window and spotted them. They didn't want others to bother Yang, and they seemed to have manipulated Yang into doing something. Yang looked like a lost soul right now. Yang's father also jumped out of bed to rush to his wife's aid. He still had no idea what was going on. Yang's mother was so terrified that she nearly fainted. After assisting his wife, he also looked out the window to see what was happening to her. Yang's father was a man who had served in the army. Seeing his son surrounded by ghostly children, he stormed the door and went out into the yard. The children slowly dispersed as Yang's father approached, and Yang was still digging in the ground with his hands. The 3 spirits did not forget to leave a ghostly smile before disappearing. Their shapes also became devilishly twisted and vanished. He went to the tree where Yang was sitting and called out for him, but he didn't respond. When he saw that, he hastily lifted Yang up. Yang's body had just seemed to melt, with no resistance at all. His hands remained clutching the dirt below until his father lifted him up. He refused to let go. Both his hands, feet, and his clothes were soiled. His face was white, his mouth was still wet with saliva. His eyes were open, but he appeared to be sleeping, like a sleepwalker. Yang's father shook him constantly, fearful that something would happen to his son, and kept telling him to wake up. Fortunately, Yang's expression began to change after a while, and his eyes were no longer wide open. Yang's fingernails were painful because he had been digging in the ground with his bare hands for a long time. Yang burst into tears after regaining consciousness. Yang's parents escorted him to his room, cleaned the dirt for him, and cleaned the wound to prevent infection. Yang's father then inquired as to what had occurred earlier and why Yang had gone out to the yard. Yang whimpered about everything, even though he was afraid his parents would scold him. He was awakened in the middle of the night by the children's laughter, so he looked outside to see what was going on. Outside the window at the time, Yang noticed 3 children waving to him, accompanied by happy laughter, calling Yang to come play with them. Yang realized they were 3 children whom he had seen while having dinner. Yang was too young. He had no doubts when he jumped out of bed to go out. Yang opened the door and looked around for them. After all, they were all children, so it was understandable that they wanted to play. Yang noticed a large tree in the yard with silhouettes of children in the distance at this point. He intended to open the door to take a look, but the children kept calling from a distance. so for some reason he ran towards them unintentionally. Yang, on the other hand, felt nothing out of the ordinary and simply inquired as to why they were staying out so late. They didn't mean to keep it a secret from him. They said they died a few years ago. That surprised Yang. They claimed that someone kidnapped, murdered, and buried them under this tree, and they wanted Yang to save them. Hearing this, Yang sat down unconsciously, began digging, and then couldn't remember anything. After all, Yang wasn't afraid, and he still wanted his parents to save the children. Yang's parents were perplexed by this. They exchanged glances but said nothing. It was difficult to believe, but everything that happened tonight made them concerned a lot. They put Yang to sleep, intended to solve the problem tomorrow. The next day, Yang's father asked his village neighbors to dig up the soil beneath the tree, and as Yang stated, they had only dug a little when a skeleton was discovered beneath the mud and soil. After digging was completed, 3 sets of small skeletons were discovered beneath the tree. They immediately reported it to the police and clarified everything. According to Yang, they caught the killers. They were the girl's uncle and aunt. 2 years ago, due to a lack of money, they lured the girl to invite 2 more friends over to play and then arrested all 3 children. Someone wanted to buy them for a high price, so they loaded the 3 children into the trunk and began transporting them. They pulled over in the middle of the road to rest and also opened the trunk to inspect the children's situation. The children couldn't stand the distance and the heat of the summer, so they suffocated and died. They didn't know what to do at the time, so they dug a hole in the ground and buried the children's bodies there. Yang's grandmother died a long time ago, and Yang's parents also rarely visited, so almost no one knew about this. But they would never know. Evil deeds would be discovered. The children had been waiting for Yang for a long time. They knew that they would be saved. The story happened at the hospital where my mother worked. I was very young that year. After school, I would often go to the hospital to wait for my mother to get off work and then go do all my homework. But that day, my mother left work later than usual, until 7 o'clock in the evening, but still no sign of her. I also finished my homework a long time ago. Seeing that I was bored, my mother's colleagues gave me a tablet to watch cartoons. After a long time, I also saw my mother walking in with a colleague from outside, and everyone seemed to be giving someone first aid. My mother and her colleagues pushed the hospital bed very quickly with very serious expressions. But at that time, I was very young. I did not understand the patient's situation and my mother's work, so as soon as I saw my mother, I was very happy and ran out to call her. In return, my mother was very upset, so she asked me to sit at the table and wait for her and not to make a fuss. My mother's reaction scared me a bit. After that, my mother quickly pushed the patient away, leaving me alone in the hallway. I was a little sad, lonely, and about to cry because I was yelled at by my mother and also waiting for too long. But I also loved my mother, so I didn't want to make her sad. So I was depressed and decided to go back to the front desk to continue waiting. But just halfway through, suddenly a cold wind blew from somewhere, making my skin turn into goosebumps. It was almost summer, so there couldn't be such a cold wind. The wind was so cold that it made my body cringe, and I felt like the cold air got closer and closer to me, getting colder and colder. Suddenly a patient was walking past me, and I felt a chill emanating from him that made me look up. But I didn't know why or when I looked at this man, I felt so scared. This feeling made my body tremble. Then he also turned his head and looked at me. His face was wrinkled, the hair was white and the skin was very pale, looking very scary. He didn't do anything to me, but I was so scared that I cried. My mind went blank, but I was still afraid of what he would do to me. But then he turned around and continued towards the emergency room. The strange thing was that no one seemed to have seen him. As he passed me, the coldness gradually subsided. He also walked very fast, like just passing people in the hallway. Soon he was at the door of the emergency room where my mother had just entered. Looking at his back, I saw him just standing there and looking inside, his figure looking somber. At that time, I just thought it must be a patient's family member visiting his family member. Even though I kept looking at him, I still had a feeling of fear. But that's all I didn't want to care about anymore. I turned to go back to the front desk, intending to continue waiting for my mother to finish her work. But curiosity kept me watching to see what he would do. After looking into the emergency room, I saw him sitting in the waiting chair in front of the room. Suddenly he turned around and looked straight at me. As soon as he saw that I was also watching him, he immediately reached out to me and waved as if I wanted to go there. I didn't understand why, but I was scared at that time. But I still obeyed and walked over to the older man. I felt like he was trying to tell me something important. When I got there, he started asking me strange things. He was surprised when I saw him. At that time, I didn't understand what he meant. As soon as I heard that I could see him, his expression became more terrifying, but he seemed very happy. He wanted to ask me to do a favor for him before he passed away. At that time, I was a little surprised when an older man asked me to help with something, and he also said some very strange things. Without waiting for my consent, he asked me to meet his son and said that there was a passbook under the drawer in his room. He couldn't speak now. He could only count on me. Hearing this, I still wondered why he didn't say it by himself, and where was he going to go after all? Before I could reframe what he had just asked, the door to the emergency room opened. Mother and her colleagues also came out from the inside, accompanied by disappointed expressions. Seeing me, my mother was also very surprised. Quickly asked me what I was doing here, why not wait for her at the front desk? Walking around was easy to get lost. I quickly explained about the older man talking to me. So while crying, I sobbed, pointed to the waiting chair, saying that the older man was sitting there. But when I looked back, the older man was no longer there. I was also extremely surprised and confused because now it looked like I was lying. I looked everywhere to look for the older man, but he was nowhere to be found. At this time, my mother started to get annoyed and frustrated because she thought that the work was stressful and I still came to disturb her, so she quickly took my hand and pushed me away. I cried as I tried to explain to my mother and everyone about the older man. I also did not forget to describe to my mother the appearance of that older man, hoping everyone would believe what I said. But hearing this, everyone was surprised and a little panicked, because the person I just described was exactly like the older man who died in the emergency room that my mother and colleagues had just tried to save. Hearing this, my mother and everyone suddenly became silent because of panic, but I neither understood nor realized. I just thought that they didn't believe me, so I still tried to explain. My mother saw this and quickly pulled me out, so I had to leave without being able to help the older man with anything. I also didn't pay attention to the older man's request and followed my mother to leave. That night, after having dinner, I quickly went to bed because the following day was the first day of the week I had to go to school. After falling asleep for a while, I suddenly felt someone standing next to my bed. The cold air began to spread throughout the room. That made me wake up. I started to open my eyes. In my reverie, I saw a dark figure approaching in front of me. Immediately after that, I had to open my eyes wide and got up. In front of my eyes was the older man's face at night. His eyes widened and his tone was extremely angry. He whispered in my ear about my failure to help him deliver the word. I panicked and screamed at that moment. Looking back now, I feel lucky that the older man didn't do me any harm. My parents in the next room also heard the screams and ran to my room in a panic. The light was turned on and the older man also disappeared. Seeing my parents, I quickly hugged and sobbed. I told them about the older man who came to find me because I didn't help him. Only now did my mother listen and ask me to explain everything. Before, although I wanted to clarify, she still thought that I was too young for her to listen to me. I started talking about the cold wind in the hallway and how I met the strange older man. Then, what the older man asked me to tell his son. I also talked about seeing the older man standing next to the bed with an angry expression. The very following morning, my father was off work and took me to the hospital. My mother also found information about the older man and met his son. I told the son everything. He was also very surprised and emotional. Just the next day, the son came to see my family, and he bowed his head to thank us for actually having a passbook in the drawer that his father had left behind. If it weren't for me, the older man wouldn't have been able to get away with peace of mind. When I was a kid, every summer my mother would take me to my grandmother's house to visit her. I was always excited because she would always tell me such interesting stories. Because my mother had a lot of work to do in the city and would return here to pick me up in 2 weeks, my grandma immediately told me a very interesting story to console me. Her family was a wealthy family in the area at the time, and she was very attractive. That was why, despite the fact that she was only 16 years old, many people approached her for matchmaking. One day, a family approached the matchmaker and asked her to assist them in proposing to marry my grandmother. After the matchmaker spoke with her father, which was my great-grandfather, he seemed to be pleased with the other family, so he cheerfully told her to set a date for the two sides to meet. A few days later, the other family made an appointment to meet, and the two families enjoyed some tea and a joyful conversation. Fortunately, the couple fell in love with each other at the first sight. They couldn't take their eyes off each other and decided to come together. He rode a donkey to meet her every few days. Because the two villages were quite far apart and he had to cross a forest, sometimes he was simply going to see her for a few minutes and then giving her a cake or a small gift just to see her. Then he hurried back home on his donkey, because if he stayed any longer, the journey back would be even more dangerous. The two agreed to meet again a few days before the wedding. He rummaged through his pockets and began to pull something out. After a while of searching, he pulled out a beautiful and sparkling golden hairpin from his shirt. He stated that this would be an engagement gift, and that when he picked her up as a bride, he would like her to bring it along. She was both surprised and moved by this. The hairpin was exquisitely sculpted, resembling a flower in full bloom. She didn't dare to use it because it was too beautiful. Part of her wanted to keep it for the consummation night, so she carefully stored it in a wooden box lined with red fabric. Soon after, the wedding day arrived. She put on stunning makeup and a crimson bridal gown. Her hand was still holding the box containing the gold hairpin as she sat on the bride's palanquin. There were drums and trumpets outside making cheerful sounds, and her brother followed to take her to the husband's house. Suddenly, she heard her brother talking loudly outside. She realized the group was being pursued by robbers. Her brother advised her to stay inside and never go outside because he was concerned about her. Despite her fears, she made sure to carefully place the box containing the gold brooch in the sealed trunk under the bride's chair. Because she was too worried, she secretly lifted the curtain and peered outside to see how things were going. At the time, she noticed that in addition to the bride's procession group, there were some other strange men, that the two sides were fighting fiercely, and that the robbers were extremely daring. However, it appeared that the bandits were weaker, so after a while they were quickly defeated by the bride procession group and her brother. She was relieved to see this, so she closed the curtain and sat down on the chair to relax. Soon after, she couldn't hear the noise outside anymore, and the palanquin began to move and was lifted. She assumed that the robbery issue had been resolved, but because everyone was so quiet, she inquired outside. But no one responded. Instead, the sound of drums continued, but it was not lively as it had been. She was terrified as she listened closely, because the drum trumpet was no longer playing happy songs, but rather funeral music. She hastily opened the curtains to look outside and look for her brother, feeling increasingly strange. The person carrying the palanquin in front of her, however, was not at all like the original group. His hairstyle and even his clothes were unusual, which surprised her. What was more terrifying was that the people carrying the palanquin had no legs at all, as if they were floating through the air. One of them turned to look at her after hearing the noise coming from the palanquin. Now she could clearly see his face was pale and looked like sores, and his eyes were lifeless. It terrified her so much that she screamed and retreated into the palanquin, not daring to look. They didn't seem to care about her and continued to carry the palanquin forward. In fear, she jumped out of the palanquin, hoping no one would notice. Therefore, she slipped and fell, landing on the road with her head hit on a roadside stone. It caused her head to bleed profusely, as well as fatigue in her body. Despite the fact that she could now flee, she recalled the golden hairpin he had given her, which was still in the palanquin. With tears in her eyes, she decided to take another risk and return to find the group of people who were carrying the palanquin. They didn't seem to notice or care that she had jumped out of the palanquin. Except for their frightening appearances, everything appeared to be a normal wedding ceremony with trumpets and drums and music. Someone was still carrying a large wooden trunk containing dowry behind them. But these people looked scary. Also, their skin was grey, their eyes were white with no irises. They appeared lifeless. It was a wedding ceremony, but it was a gloomy one. So she kept a low profile, hiding behind the bushes on the side of the road so no one would notice. The palanquin was also stopped and placed on the ground after more than 30 minutes. On closer inspection, however, this area seemed to be a mass burial area with numerous large and small graves. They gathered in front of the largest of them all and dug with their hands. The outer layer of soil and rock was removed, revealing a large coffin within. They took a gold hairpin box and placed it above the coffin. It was like returning items to their rightful owner. Finally, they filled the tomb with dirt to return to its original state, bowed a few times and then vanished. Hiding behind, she was watching everything and feeling extremely strange and curious. They had almost no intention of harming her. However, witnessing such a strange thing made her extremely scared, intending to follow to retrieve the gold hair pin, but it had now been buried inside the grave. So she fled in the opposite direction, hoping to run to join her bride possession group or someone who could assist her. Finally, she didn't know how long she ran for, possibly more than an hour, when she met her brother, who was looking for her everywhere because she had suddenly vanished. She finally dared to breathe a sigh of relief and hug her brother as soon as she saw him. Then she told her brother everything, and she wanted the entire group to accompany her to find the graves. However, for some reason, the group searched for a long time but did not discover any of the graves she described. Because things did not go as planned, both families agreed to reschedule the wedding ceremony for a more auspicious date. Following the marriage ceremony, the couple was required to go and greet elderly members of the husband's family to whom they related the events of the previous day. So he suddenly remembered an old story, most likely related to the incident of the bride procession group. In the past, this land had a young king who ruled cruelly, making people miserable. But his reign was brief, and he died when he was just over 40 years old. The people who lived there began to disperse and moved to other villages and lands to live. A large tomb was built for him, but no one took care of it. According to legend, the gold hairpin was left to him by his late wife and was buried with him when he died. However, because no one cared for him, his grave was soon dug up by grave robbers who stole the golden hairpin. Coincidentally, she brought the hairpin and passed by near the grave on the day of the wedding. Perhaps they had been looking for the hairpin for a long time, as it was also the object of the old owner. This heartbreaking story took place in a small city in the north. The pitiful but also blameworthy person in this story was a boy named Beto. The boy's mother died early in an accident, so he lived with his father. At first, the father and son's life was very peaceful and happy, but a year later, his father married a new wife and his life also started to be sad from that point on. Since his stepmother moved in together, Beto was beaten and scolded by his father, even though his father had never done it before. On the contrary, Beto's father always loved his new wife very much. Sometimes later, Beto learned that his stepmother was pregnant. The quarrels between him and his father became more and more intense. In the eyes of Beto's father now, he was a rebellious and stubborn boy who was disruptive. In Beto's heart, there was only one mother. He did not accept and allow the stepmother to take the place of his mother. Time flew. The stepmother's belly was getting bigger and bigger. One day, after his father and stepmother went shopping together for the baby, they also bought Beto a clothed doll. Beto saw the gift, but he did not feel happy. On the contrary, he became angrier because he thought his stepmother was deliberately humiliating him, assuming that he had the same hobbies as girls. Afraid of affecting the fetus and affecting his wife, Beto's father silently threatened to force him to learn to be obedient if Beto did not want his pocket money to be cut. Because Beto didn't want to be with his stepmother, he made excuses to eat outside every day. Without pocket money, he wouldn't be able to live. Beto reluctantly accepted the doll and sadly went back to his room. He couldn't hide his anger, so he slammed the door in front of his father and stepmother. Outside, the father and stepmother were also tired of Beto's ignorant and disrespectful behavior. After entering the room, Beto directly threw the doll on the ground and cried silently on the bed. At this time, he felt very lonely and sad. Beto cried out alone for an hour and fell asleep because he was tired. The following morning, when Beto woke up, he saw the doll sitting on the ground. The more he looked at it, the more sulky Beto felt. He angrily picked up the doll and was about to throw it out. As soon as he went to the door, Beto saw his stepmother going somewhere. The hatred in the boy's heart began to rise. Beto suddenly had an idea and threw the doll towards his stepmother. He immediately called his stepmother and asked her to help pick up the doll. The stepmother turned her head when she heard Beto's voice and couldn't help but be surprised to see that the doll she gave Beto yesterday was lying at her feet. Seeing that his stepmother didn't say anything nor react, Beto pretended to care about his stepmother and said he would pick it up himself. Seeing that, the stepmother thought that Beto had accepted her, so she was happy and wanted to pick up the doll for him. After saying that, she slowly bent down to pick up the doll. Beto also took the opportunity to sneak around behind his stepmother's back. Then Beto quickly pushed the stepmother's back with his hand. Due to loss of balance, the stepmother fell forward. Because her belly was too big, it hit the ground hard. The stepmother began to feel severe abdominal pain, then fainted from loss of blood. At this point, under her body was all blood, and the baby in her belly was dead. The blood flowed out in a stream and stuck to the doll next to it. Beto looked at his stepmother lying on the ground, a satisfied smile on the corner of his mouth. At that time, the boy felt happy that no one could take his father anymore. Beto hurriedly picked up the doll and hurriedly left. Then he threw the doll in the corner of the room where no one else could find it. Next, he pretended to be the first person to spot the injured person and called for an ambulance. After taking the stepmother to the hospital, Beto became a hero. Because the doctors all said that if it came a little later, the mother's life could not be saved. Although the fetus died, Beto's stepmother was fine. Beto's father immediately wanted to buy some food to nourish his wife. He also told Beto to take care of his stepmother. Beto's father didn't wait for him to answer, then hurriedly left, leaving Beto alone in the emergency room. Beto looked at the shadow of his father was far away. Suddenly, he felt extremely scared. He was worried that if his stepmother woke up, the truth would be surely exposed. Beto went inside and took a sneak peek. At this time, the stepmother woke up and couldn't help but mourn for the dead baby. Beto saw the fruit knife next to him. He suddenly had a desire to kill because he was afraid that his father would kill him if he knew everything. Without thinking too much, Beto made up his mind. He took the fruit knife and went to his stepmother's bed. When she heard footsteps, the stepmother looked up and broke down in tears when she saw Beto holding the knife. Beto walked to the bed, only called his stepmother's name once, and suddenly smiled a ghostly smile. That smile scared the stepmother. She knew the one pushing her was Beto. She didn't expect Beto to be so scary. In this situation, Beto was also extremely worried and hesitant about whether to stab his stepmother to death or not. Although she hated Beto very much, the child in her stomach was also lost. The stepmother said she did not intend to denounce Beto and promised to tell everyone she accidentally fell. Just when Beto hesitated and his stepmother was scared, his father suddenly shouted from behind. Beto turned his head in surprise, knowing that he had been discovered. Beto pretended to say that he just wanted to peel apples for his stepmother to eat. However, Beto's father could not believe his explanation because there were no fruits in the room. The father ordered Beto to give him the knife immediately. Holding the knife behind him, Beto tried to cut his hand with the knife. Seeing the blood dripping, Beto's stepmother understood what he meant. She did not want to break the relationship between father and son, so she explained that she wanted to eat apples, but later realized there were no apples in the room. Beto's father immediately believed his wife and said nothing more, gently telling Beto to return home first. Beto rushed home because he didn't dare and didn't want to stay in the hospital anymore. After Beto left, the stepmother hugged Beto's father to relieve the pain in her heart. She also did not tell Beto's crimes to his father. At home, Beto also felt tormented and scared. He was afraid of his stepmother telling the truth and afraid of being sent to a reformatory for criminal children. But after that, everything was fine. A month later, Beto's stepmother was discharged from the hospital, but they did not return home. Later, Beto learned that his father and stepmother had bought another house and started a new life without him. Beto's father would transfer money to him once a month. All Beto's living expenses were covered by his father. When he saw his father leave, Beto was heartbroken. Now Beto felt that the world no longer loved him. Over time, Beto began to live alone. One day, after returning from school, Beto saw the doll he had thrown away lying at the door. The doll still had blood on it, and Beto immediately thought that maybe it was his stepmother who'd brought it to scare him. Beto didn't even look at the doll. He kicked it away and went into the house. Late at night, when Beto went to sleep, he had a strange dream. In the dream, Beto was chased by a child. The child kept asking Beto to play with him, making Beto extremely scared. Although he could not see the child talking, Beto could completely hear its voice coming from his brain. Chased by the child, Beto risked his life to run forward despite the endless space ahead. While Beto was deep asleep, the doll he kicked in the afternoon suddenly entered the room and stood staring at him in the dark. The doll then jumped onto Beto's face, covering his nose, mouth, and using its weight, causing him to suffocate. 2 days later, Beto's father tried to call home several times, but he didn't receive a reply. His father decided to go back home to check it out, and he found out Beto was dead. Beto's eyes, nose, and mouth were all covered with cotton wool. Beto's corpse was so scary that it haunted his father for a long time. Beto's father called the police soon after, and after the police investigated, they did not find any trace of the perpetrator. Therefore, the case was still unfinished. Everyone then focused on Beto's corpse, but no one noticed that in the corner of the room, there was an abandoned doll. It showed a very strange smile. It had a face like a baby and was crying silently. No one knew that inside the doll lived another world, and Beto's soul had been trapped there. Time later, Beto's death still torments Beto's father and stepmother. They only blamed themselves for the carelessness that caused the death of their poor son. It occurred in the spring of 2001, and it became a very well-known story that year. There was a very wealthy family in the village, and the oldest son, Shen, celebrated a big wedding with a village girl named Lan. The wedding was grand and crowded, with many attending to bless the bride and groom. The groom's friends began to tease as well, as if it were a ritual before allowing the two to get into the wedding room for consummation. On the bride's side, some friends and bridesmaids had come to celebrate, so they took advantage of the opportunity to chat with the bride before she officially joined her husband's house. At first, it was just a fun conversation, but then Shen's friends began getting drunk and making fun of the groom, which became increasingly outrageous. They were no longer teasing only the bride, but rather the bridesmaids, who were also in the room. They also forced her to make some pretty subtle jokes. Everyone was drunk at the moment, so the bride couldn't stop the groom's friends. But just as everyone was making a lot of noise, a friend of the bride who was also a bridesmaid at the wedding burst out of the next room. People didn't understand what was going on when they saw her crying and screaming and fled quickly. Her name was May. She ran out of the house before anyone could ask about the situation. Her clothes were strewn about, and her hair was a mess. Everyone was still stunned, but inside the room a friend of the groom was Wu. His face was red, possibly from inebriation. He was not wearing a shirt and was still holding his pants, and he was also perplexed. Wu appeared to have had a bad intention towards May when he saw her sleeping in the bride's room while being drunk, causing her to panic. The bride was furious and scolded him. Everything was serious, but Wu still believed that it wasn't as exaggerated as the bride claimed to be. He was simply drunk, and he blamed May for lying in that room with such a revealing dress on. Hearing this, the bride became enraged, chasing May while turning around to curse Wu. Because May was getting married next month, Wu's actions would jeopardize her honor. Following that, both the bride and the groom dashed out to find May, afraid of that something bad would happen to her while running out this late. May, on the other hand, ran quickly to the forest. She was a very sensitive person, and Lan was afraid that she would have done something reckless, so Lan enlisted the help of everyone to find her. Everyone then raced to find May. This area was quite dark and large, and the longer it took, the more worried Lan became about her friend. People looked for her for half an hour, but couldn't find her. Everyone was talking about going deeper into the forest. After a while of searching, there were results, but what they saw in front of them caused everyone to panic and bewilder. May hanged herself on a tree branch with only her lingerie on, possibly because it was too humiliating and made her consider suicide. Everyone was terrified when they saw the scene. In the dark night, a flashlight flickered, casually shining directly on May's face, revealing the terrifying face of a hanged man, tongue sticking out, eyes open wide and full of blood veins, looking extremely terrified. That angry face and eyes seemed to be looking directly at Wu, who had just done bad things to May. Following that, Wu was arrested for the crime of indirectly causing death and causing mental damage to the deceased's family. However, having lots of relationships and bribe money, he was released the next day because they thought May purposefully committed suicide, which caused outrage among the villagers, but he didn't care and went straight home. It rained heavily that night, and despite the fact that he raped May, he had a wife. His wife began questioning and blaming him as soon as he returned home. The two had a heated argument. The wife couldn't accept his behavior and accused him of being such a terrible man. His parents couldn't stand up for him in this situation. All they could do was give up as they watched the couple squabble. The wife was sobbing while talking, but he neither seemed to mind nor felt bad about it. The more she talked, the more irritated he became, and his wife couldn't take it any longer, so she proposed divorce. He agreed right away, without hesitation. His parents, who were standing outside, were equally impatient and concerned because divorce was no minor issue. If they divorced, it would be extremely difficult to find a new husband for her. However, according to the father, it was his fault, not his wife's. Everyone in this village realized he made a terrible mistake, so no one dared to be with him. His parents heard rash voices continuing from inside the room while he was worried and confused. They thought Wu and his wife were arguing again, so they peered into the room through the glass to keep an eye on them. They only saw the daughter-in-law sitting on the bed, holding her head with both hands, her mouth muttering something inaudible, and she looked like in great pain. They assumed it was because Wu had beaten his wife. Otherwise, why was she holding her head in such pain? But when they looked closely, they panicked. The wife's entire face began to change, becoming strange and frightening. Her body turned pale, her face was green, and her tongue was protruding over her chin. She approached Wu with a resentful expression. Wu had also begun to doze off at this point, so he had no idea what was going on behind his back. His parents stood outside, being aware of that something was wrong, and attempted to wake up Wu by banging on the window. Hearing the noise, he began to roll over, but his eyes remained closed. The wife was now very close to Wu. It was too late by the time he could wake up and open his eyes. His wife was standing right next to him, looking at his wife's face now. He immediately remembered May's face when she was hanged to death. His parents were also eager to enter the room to assist their son, knowing that the wife has been possessed by May. They were nervously screaming, knowing that this was the ghost coming back for revenge, which usually never ended well. So they burst in through the main door and dashed inside the house to the couple's bedroom door. The father tried repeatedly banging on the door and calling out his son's name. but there was no response from the inside. After several attempts to bang on the door without success, the father decided to use force to smash through it. Fortunately, the door was made of wood and was relatively thin, so they were able to get inside after a few hits. However, the scene in front of them caused them extreme panic. The Wu couple was currently on the bed with large puddles of blood splattered all over the room. The mother cried pitifully. Looked like Wu was stabbed and cut by a sharp knife, and the wife passed out on the bed, still clutching a large knife. The two rushed Wu to the hospital, but even if he arrived quickly, Wu would not be able to survive due to excessive blood loss. The news of Wu's death quickly spread throughout the village, and almost no one sympathized as a result, believing that this was the retribution he deserved. People usually come to help at funerals or weddings in the village, but no one did this time. Instead, they stood outside, curiously. After that, the mother went insane and spent her days wandering on the streets looking for her child. And the wife was imprisoned. While being there, she went insane because she couldn't remember why she had killed her husband in such a way. This story is about a rather scary case that Captain Chow had taken on. It was a massacre in a family. Only the lucky 7-year-old child still lived and was sent to a mental institution. The case that year had many strange points, so Captain Chow decided to turn the case over. Chow reached out to an industry friend who had participated in the investigation that year. However, he advised Captain Chow not to investigate the case again. But Captain Chow was adamant because he had a feeling that something was not clear. When Captain Chow arrived at the mental hospital, the colleague reminded Captain Chow that the son of the family was currently very mentally ill. And when coming to see that son, Captain Chow might not be able to investigate anything. The special thing was that the son always said that his father massacred the whole family because he was possessed by a ghost. At that time, the colleague was just starting out to work, but also witnessed the case that day. The whole family was brutally murdered. Captain Chow said that after reading the case report, he felt the son's testimony was very grounded. The colleague felt that Captain Chow must have a problem because he believed in this fictional story. Looking into the room, the son was now much older. He had a thin figure and was standing thoughtfully looking out the window. The teammate and Captain Chow entered the room. The son seemed very shy and panicked about everything. The policeman said hello to him, but he was very cautious. His eyes were sneaky and scared. The face was haggard as if running away from something. He signaled to everyone to keep their voices down because the thing could hear and kill them all. Then the son went under the bed to hide. Perhaps seeing his father kill the whole family made him obsessed. The colleague told Captain Chow that this crazy young man always hid from everyone around and no one could come in close contact. Captain Chow still managed to sit down and reassure his son. Captain Chow used a soft voice and believable actions to build trust with the son. Under the bed, the son lit a lot of candles. "I believe you. Tell me about that day," Captain Chow said. After hearing that someone believed what he said, the son suddenly changed his face and hesitated whether to come out or not. His colleague and Captain Chow together pulled him out. Now he was calmer. Then the son sat crouched on the bed and was able to speak clearly. Captain Chow felt that it was just because he was too scared. The son was psychologically affected because he was young at that time. This time the son opened his heart more and began to remember the past. The colleague also built trust with the son, saying that the captain was very good, could solve all cases, so he told Captain Chow everything. Hearing this, the son suddenly asked for help from Captain Chow. He kept saying that his father was wronged. Captain Chow reassured him and asked him to tell every detail. There would be a way to clear the case. Then the son crouched on the bed and began to tell his story. He was about 7 years old that year. His family lived in a poor village but lived together very happily. That day his father came home early from work, so he bought gifts for the whole family. Dad loved his family very much and never raised his voice at him. That night the whole family of 5 sat together. His father pulled out supplies and food he bought while on a business trip, including candies and candles of all kinds. All were delicious. Candles were also very special, unlike ordinary candles. They also had a very pleasant fragrance. His grandmother loved the scent of his candle, so she showed it to grandfather. His grandfather said that he had heard about scented candles. Only rich people had because the scent was very pleasant. Immediately his grandmother lit the candle. The whole family gathered together very happily. The scent from the candle made the whole house fragrant. After a while, the candle was about to burn out. Suddenly the father's face began to deteriorate, sweating profusely and looking very tired. At this time the father asked the family's permission to go inside and rest first.
"Oh, he must have just come back from a long trip, so he's tired. Just let him go,"
the grandfather told the family. While talking happily, the faces of the mother and son became frightened. The father was now acting crazy, holding a big knife, and was attacking the grandfather. Without mercy, the father cut his grandfather's head in half with a knife in front of the whole family. The wife and son were extremely scared to the point of being motionless, not knowing what was wrong with her husband. Everyone was shocked by what had just happened. Then the father seemed to be controlled by something. His eyes were white and he turned to look at the rest of the family with cold eyes. The grandmother could not run away in time because of her advanced age. She could only plead with her mouth. But she was also brutally murdered by him. After seeing that, the wife hugged her son and ran to the door to call for help. But the father saw them. His next target was his wife and son. He held a bloody knife in his hand and began to chase the mother and son out of the door. At the moment, the son looked back and discovered a terrible thing that haunted him to this day. It was behind the father. Another shadowy figure was following. The shadow looked at the mother and son and gave a creepy smile. As soon as she ran to the door, the wife immediately met a neighbor's family who was visiting, thinking that she would be saved. They were surprised to see that the wife, who was holding a child and covered in blood, also hurriedly asked, but the wife was too scared to run away. The wife couldn't stop and explain anything. She just told everyone to run away because her husband was crazy. Before understanding what was happening, the husband ran with a knife and slaughtered the poor neighbor's family. The wife was able to run away to the gate at this time, but because the woman was weak and still carrying a small child, she could not run fast. In the end, the husband caught the wife. He swung his knife and slashed at his wife's back, causing her pain. In an emergency, she was able to throw the child out, and she stayed behind to stop her husband. Before closing the gate herself, she could only scream for her child to run away. The carefree child could only watch his mother being murdered by his father. The last scene has haunted the son to this day. At that time, fortunately, the neighbors heard the noise, pulled over and arrested the husband, so the boy was able to escape death. Even now, sitting down to tell these stories, the son's body was still shaking with fear. The son thought that his father was possessed by a demon. This thing was the reason why his father killed the whole family. After hearing that, Captain Chow comforted him and left. The colleagues still couldn't believe that Captain Chow continued to want to turn this case over just because of the testimony of an abnormal person. The colleague told Captain Chow to relax and rest, why he had to find a job that made him so busy. But Captain Chow directly rejected him and firmly went to investigate this case. After seeing that Captain Chow was so determined, the colleague did not stop him anymore. He actively told the captain the specific address of the house where the murder took place, and still didn't forget to tell the captain to be careful. Captain Chow quickly came to the house that night. The house had been abandoned since the incident. Over the years, the house became dilapidated. Captain Chow opened the gate and shone his flashlight inside. The yard was overgrown with weeds and Captain Chow slowly entered the house. Very quickly he reached the inside of the house. The surrounding walls were rotting and seemed to fall at any moment. He flashed his flashlight around the house for clues. His flashlight suddenly went out, but obviously this was a new flashlight. How could the battery run out so quickly? He tried to tap the flashlight to light it up because it was impossible to see anything without the flashlight. Suddenly, he heard noises from behind, which made him wary. In the end, he had to light a match to catch some of the glimmers of light so he could see the way. He entered each room to look for clues, to the room where the massacre began. He suddenly saw something mentioned in the story that the son had told. It was a candle that was bought by the father when he was on a business trip. Perhaps it was a good candle, so it had been intact for many years. Without thinking much, Captain Chow lit a match on the candle to make it easier to light things up, and thanks to the candle he continued to go around the house to investigate. As he was about to step out, Captain Chow felt someone standing behind him. Quickly turning to look back, the ghosts of the person who was murdered that year gradually appeared before his eyes. At first, the grandfather and the grandmother approached Captain Chow and appeared more and more clearly. Then both, the wife and the husband as the killer, also appeared and flew towards the captain. In the end, all the dead people appeared. For a moment, Captain Chow was terrified. They approached Captain Chow as if to attack him. Their faces were full of hatred and very scary. Immediately, one after another, the ghosts reached out and rushed towards Chow. Attacked so violently, Captain Chow dropped the candle and it went out. Captain Chow was strangled to the point that he thought he could no longer breathe, when suddenly an accident saved his life. Captain Chow had stepped on a nail. It had pinned his foot through his shoe. It hurt him, but it did wake him up. When he opened his eyes, the evil spirits he saw earlier had all disappeared. This made him begin to doubt the candle. He then quickly left the house to return to headquarters. At the headquarters, Captain Chow brought the candle back for forensic examination, and the result was that the fragrance for this lamp was a herb that could easily cause people to hallucinate. So what he saw at the house yesterday was a hallucination. Forensics also said that if the body was tired or stressed, it was easy to be affected by this candle. Hearing this, Captain Chow understood the problem, so he said goodbye to the medical examiner and left. He went straight to the mental hospital to report the results to the other mentally ill son. After hearing the truth, the son was surprised and couldn't believe his ears. Captain Chow also said that the murder had nothing to do with his father, and that the ghost he saw was also a hallucination, all by this candle. And Captain Chow also advised the son to forget the old story and start over. everything was clear. Listening to the captain's advice, the son seemed to have returned to normal. As Captain Chow was about to leave, the manager at the hospital called him back. He wanted to thank Captain Chow. Thanks to him, the other son's condition was much better. And according to the manager at the hospital, maybe the son would be discharged soon and return to a normal life. Captain Chow was summoned urgently that morning. He rushed to the headquarters. It was too crowded in the morning to get from the dormitory to the headquarters, so he couldn't take a cab. He had to run, which made him sweat a lot. Everyone could see that there was a serious case that required Captain Chow's attention, which was why he was in such a hurry. And as expected, as soon as he walked into the office, Boss Lu Feng asked him to lead some people to the end of the town. Captain Chow wanted to learn more about the case so that it could be handled efficiently. According to the village newspaper, there had been many disappearances and murders in recent days, said Boss Lu Feng.
Oh, was it because of a wild animal?
Captain asked.
According to reports, the culprit was the ghost of an elderly woman and her cat.
This surprised the captain because despite having seen many strange cases, the ghost of an old woman and a cat could kill people still very shockingly. People were currently confused because it was a remote village. People believed the police wouldn't care, so they might act quickly to assist people. When Captain Chow heard this, he immediately took orders and set off. He and his comrades went to village in casual clothes to make the quest easier. When they arrived, the village chief greeted them enthusiastically and cheerfully. The captain went straight to the point and inquired about the case. On the way, the chief told them that the story began with an old woman named Lang, and that when she died, everything had changed. She was over 70 years old this year and lived with a son and daughter-in-law, but the son frequently worked far away and the daughter-in-law frequently cursed at her. Because she was an elderly woman, she often wet her pants with urine unconsciously. The daughter-in-law was so frustrated that she had to do the laundry all day, so she yelled at her constantly. She could only keep quiet when she heard that she was too old and her living only made her children and grandchildren unhappy. The only thing that brought her comfort was her cat, what had been with her for over 10 years. She hugged the cat and went into the room that day, but she didn't go out of the room the next day. The son came home from work and heard that his mother was still in the room, so he went in to find and comfort her. He believed that his wife was just talking nonsense and that his mother didn't need to pay attention to that. He opened the door and walked in, but the scene in front of him astounded him. The old woman hanged herself in her room, probably to not burden her children. The cat, what was lying beneath her body, also stared at him angrily and hissed in a frightening manner. It then darted past him and fled. He took his mother's body down quickly and bemoaned the fact that he did not take better care of her. He cried a lot at this point because he thought he was so unfaithful that his mother had to commit suicide. But no matter how much he cried, his mother could not be revived. But it looked like his mother didn't want to die. Her eyes remained open wide and filled with hatred. Because the funeral required extensive preparations, her body was still kept in the house. That night, the wife was gathering firewood to cook. All of a sudden, she screamed out because she saw something. When the husband heard his wife screaming, he rushed to the scene. The old woman's cat died behind the firewood after being poisoned by rat poison. Suddenly there was a loud noise coming from the room where the old woman's body was found. The son thought his mother was still alive. He was upbeat. He dashed in there to check and his wife followed him. When they arrived, they were both taken aback. The mother was standing tall in front of them as if nothing had happened. The daughter-in-law became nervous, but the son still believed his mother was alive, so he called out to her. Suddenly, the old woman turned around, her face disfigured into that of a cat, complete with bright green eyes and fangs. When she saw the two of them, she squealed like a cat and became extremely angry. Her face looked extremely frightening. She pounced on them, her movements as quick as those of a cat. The terrified wife fled immediately, left her husband behind. Obviously, this was his mother's body, so the husband had no time to react out of astonishment. She was no longer a person at this point. Looked like the other cat had entered her body, and it didn't care who the son was anymore. It immediately attacked him with its claws. She pinned him down, unable to resist, and tore all of his flesh with her cat claws. He screamed for his mother to let him go, but to no avail. The cat seemed to hate him so much that it continued to tear up his flesh. At this point, the wife bolted, screaming for help as she ran. She ran through the neighbor's house, banging on the door, hoping that someone would save her. When neighbors heard the knock on the door, they gathered to see what was going on. After hearing her story, young men in the village took up some sticks and went over to investigate. They entered the gate and called for her husband, but no one answered, so they began to take precautions. As they dug deeper into the house, they noticed bloodstains on the ground. It looked like footprints started from inside the house. When they realized this, they let one of them to guard outside while the other two went inside the house. The dim lighting made it difficult for them to see their surroundings, but the stench of blood was unbearable. The husband's body gradually appeared under the bright moonlight, causing them to panic. His body and face were ripped apart by deep scratches, and it appeared that he was extremely terrified before he died. They were startled when they heard a loud noise outside. They all dashed out to check. They were now frozen by the scene. The old woman was sitting on the roof, but her posture was that of a cat. With a cat's face, its big mouth full of sharp teeth, it looked at everyone and then squealed ferociously. Then she fled from house to house, then vanished. Now the daughter-in-law also became insane. Chickens and ducks in the village, as well as the children, were being stolen. The village chief was expecting that the children would be found soon. Captain Chow stated that they would stay for 2 days in order to investigate the case. The village chief was overjoyed, and he arranged for them to stay at the village guest home. Following that, the two of them began to split up and patrol the village at night. There were still no leads by the second night, and the captain kept patrolling the area. Suddenly, he noticed someone acting suspiciously. He had his face covered and a sack in his hand. He exited from a resident's house, looked like a thief. Captain Chow immediately came forward to ask for clarification, but he didn't seem to want to answer and appeared to be scared. The captain kicked him in the back just as he was about to flee, causing him to fall. He then rushed over to restrain him and question him about his behavior. He tied the guy up and went to look inside the sack and discovered that he was the one who abducted children in the village. The captain returned the child to the family before escorting the criminal away. He heard screams and gunshots on his way back to his room. Knowing something had happened to his comrade, he quickly tied the kidnapper to a tree and fled to the site. When the captain arrived at the location and saw that his comrade had been seriously injured on the arm, he inquired about the situation. When the comrade saw the captain, he quickly informed about the situation. He noticed the person sitting in the corner while patrolling the village. When he approached the person to inquire, she suddenly turned her face. It was the old woman possessed by a cat, and she was eating a raw chicken. In the dark, her eyes glowed with a frightening green light, so he quickly pulled out his gun and asked her to surrender, but she seemed to not understand what he was saying. She threw the half-eaten chicken to his face. He reached out his hand reflexively to prevent it. She rushed to attack him at that precise moment. She was lightning fast, her nails were razor sharp, and she broke his arm in deep cuts. Not allowing her to flee, the officer quickly turned around and fired a gunshot at her. The bullet struck on her right shoulder, causing her to howl in agony. Captain Chow bandaged his shady comrade and they both pursued the elderly woman. But there was no trace of her, only a pool of blood found on the ground. The captain returned to the headquarters and ordered a large number of police officers to search for her because she was injured and couldn't run far. Very soon after receiving intelligence, the police arrested and shot an elderly cat-faced woman, transporting her to the headquarters for forensic examination. Both of them, as well as Boss Lu Feng, were summoned to confirm whether or not it was her. Forensic removed the white sheet and Boss Lu Feng summoned the captain and his comrade to come and identify them. Because of her frightening appearance, they could identify her just by looking at the first sight. It was a cat-faced old lady with numerous bullet wounds on her body. According to the investigation, the children were also discovered, and the person who was arrested was a trafficker who had nothing to do with the cat-faced old lady. Rumors and articles about the elderly woman were widely circulated at the time. It was exaggerated so much that people still mention it years later. This was a rather scary story that Investigation Team X encountered. Captain Lee and Inspector Leo returned to the headquarters after a long business trip. Leo was feeling hungry now and was about to ask Captain Leo to eat. But suddenly, Captain Lee's cell phone rang. After hearing a few sentences, Captain Leo's expression suddenly changed.
Hurry up! Another strange case!
Captain Lee urged Leo to hurry up back to the interrogation room. It seemed that this was an extremely bizarre and creepy case that made Captain Lee care especially. The incident happened in an apartment building in the city. Here, a group of people from the management wanted to enter a woman's house to check. They suspected the girl was doing something illegal. But the girl resolutely prevented them and said that they dared not to enter the house illegally. By this time, the police were also present.
Okay, calm down and tell me what's wrong,
the policeman intervened. The woman who managed the apartment building said that many people suspected that this girl was abusing children. This girl bought a house here about a year ago and lived alone. But what was confusing was that she bought a lot of food every day, like cooking for 3 to 4 people. Moreover, she lived a closed life and did not communicate with anyone. Since the declaration of information had not been completed, the manager had to come and urge her many times. But every time this girl didn't want to talk, so the manager kept knocking on the door in anger. It took a long time for her to open the door and look annoyed. Then the girl said that she would take a photocopy of the information and add it to the management later. After saying that, she slammed the door with a very cold attitude. Another strange thing was that day a person was taking her grandson to play in the park when she saw this girl passing by. Suddenly, her 4-year-old grandson burst into tears when he saw this woman. The older woman felt very strange. So she comforted the little grandchild and asked him why he was crying. But she didn't expect that the little grandchild would scare her so much that she was speechless. The child said that there were many ghosts of boys on the back of the other woman. They were hugging her, looking very scary. Although the older woman could not see anything, she thought that children's eyes were pure and could see dirty things. She thought that the child could not lie. So the people around the apartment gathered to see if there was anything shady inside this girl's house. The police almost laughed when they heard those myths and said, "You have a good intention, but you really shouldn't invade others' privacy, okay?" The policeman then turned to the girl and asked this girl to show her identification. At this point, she was really a little worried. This made the police suddenly a little suspicious. When the police wanted to see her papers, the girl thought and hesitated for a moment. Finally, she went back into the house and took her ID card and showed it to them. But he found it very strange. It turned out that the date of birth on the ID card showed that the woman was born in 1974, but the police did not believe it because the woman looked 25 years old, not a woman in her 40s. He also began to wonder if this woman was scamming to use other people's identity information to carry out illegal activities, so he wanted to go into her house to check. The woman knew that she could not prevent the police from entering the house to investigate, but she still fiercely blocked the door and made sure no one was allowed in. This made him even more suspicious, so he pushed the woman aside. The policeman entered the house and began to check each room. The woman at this point was very nervous and started shaking. When the policeman opened the bedroom door, he was shocked by the scene inside. There was no bed or table in the room, only two skinny boys sitting on the floor looking very weak. Seeing the police approaching, the two boys froze for a long time before trying to call for help.
Police! Policeman, help! Help, save us, please!
The policeman immediately called their headquarters and called an ambulance. Moments later, police and paramedics arrived. The woman was arrested by the police and taken to the station. The two boys were also taken into the hospital by medical staff for treatment. When questioned by the police, the woman only admitted that she had caused minor injuries to the boys, but she was silent when asked about how she did it. All the stories of the case were told by the boy who was being treated. The boy said that the woman was very scary. It was a terrible nightmare for two 12-year-old boys. The boy said the woman was a vampire. He said that he was an orphan in an orphanage. At the age of 8, he was adopted by this beautiful aunt. This made the boy very happy. The woman looked gentle. That night, she also made a big pot of chicken for the boy and said that it nourished his body. The boy said that the chicken had many red dates in it and it tasted a bit strange, but he still ate it very well because he had never eaten so well. Meanwhile, the other woman kept looking at the boy and smiling. Then the woman carried another pot of chicken into the bedroom, saying that there was another brother in the house. However, the boy never saw his brother. At that moment, the woman suddenly looked very scary. She gave a sinister smile. That night, the woman let the boy sleep with her. At that time, the boy felt a little strange. The boy, who had never had parents, suddenly lived in a beautiful house, seeing the silhouette of a gentle mother from the woman. He felt very happy and lucky. After dinner, the boy felt sleepy and soon he fell asleep. He didn't know how long he slept. The boy suddenly felt a sharp pain in his arm. The pain woke him up. Suddenly, the boy was startled by what happened before his eyes. The woman used a knife to make a small cut on the boy's arm and was sticking out her long tongue to suck his blood. The boy didn't know how much blood the woman sucked to make his head dizzy. Her appearance at that time looked very strange and extremely scary. The boy withdrew his arm, clutched the wound and shivered at her. The woman wiped the blood from the corner of her mouth and said he was a blood slave. The woman then threw the boy into the room with the brother she had told him about earlier. It was then that the boy saw his older brother. He also was a boy about his age, but he looked very thin. From then on, the woman took a cup filled with the blood of one of the two boys every day. The woman held an electric baton every day to threaten if the two children dared to resist. That woman barely ate any other foods, only drinking a cup of their blood a day. After that, the boy was saved and the woman was quickly arrested. This case was very strange, so she would be taken by Captain Lee next. After receiving the case, Captain Lee and Inspector Leo went to the interrogation room of the police station. On the way here, Captain Lee briefly reviewed the details of the case to facilitate the interrogation of the female vampire. After being arrested, this woman confessed to the crime, but did not disclose the motive for the crime. This made the police suspect that there were many other accomplices. In the interrogation room, the girl appeared taciturn, lowering her head with a blank expression. When meeting Captain Lee and Inspector Leo, the girl remained adamantly silent. "I think you should frankly tell the truth. It will be good for you." Captain Lee began to interrogate her. She said that she pleaded guilty. In addition to the other 2 children, she also killed 3 other children, but she still refused to disclose the process and motive of the crime. Captain Lee told her that the police had collected some important evidence. They investigated her records and learned that she worked as a PhD student for a wildlife institute after graduating in 1995. She had worked there for a year and then abruptly quit without explaining why, and she completely disappeared after that. The problem lay in that research institute. Suddenly, Captain Lee mentioned the name of Dr. John. Unexpectedly, the woman was surprised to hear the name Dr. John. At the same time, she used to be arrested for stealing blood bags from the hospital. Captain Lee confidently said that all of the information had been thoroughly investigated by the police and hoped she would cooperate. Hearing this, knowing that she couldn't hide it anymore, the woman began to tell everything. She started sobbing and said that she was Dr. John's student, and not only did he become a vampire, but so did she. Previously, her real name was Lena, and she graduated with honors in pharmacy. Then she applied for a job at a foreign-funded biotechnology company. This news made Lena very excited. Her salary when practicing here was also very high. And the person who guided her at the time was Dr. John, a knowledgeable and very talented person. However, the biological experiment project that Dr. John took her to see was extremely mysterious. He let her participate in this project only, but she didn't think much of it. At this point, she followed Dr. John into the study every day. After working for several months, she was still not sure what this project was exactly. She was only assigned to record data while Dr. John drew blood from various animals every day. Gradually, she also felt the strangeness of this project because the blood research exceeded the normal pharmacology work. Once, while Lena was reviewing the data, Dr. John suddenly walked into the lab and asked what she was doing. She thought that Dr. John would get angry, but on the contrary, he was happy to say that the experiment was successful and then asked for help. This time, Dr. John took some blood samples from her and wanted to do a new experiment. Dr. John didn't explain her questions. He just said that his ultimate goal was to experiment with human blood samples. "Okay, Lena, can you help me with this?" He took out a pill from a small box and wanted Lena to take it. "Please take the pill. Then let's see the results." He said that he wanted to see if the reaction of women's blood was different from that of men's when it reacted to drugs. Feeling that Lena was a little suspicious, Dr. John said that he would take this pill first. "Do you know how long it will take for a set of clinical trials to enter human trials?" he asked Lena. After he finished speaking, he immediately put the medicine in his mouth and swallowed it. After taking one pill, he handed the remaining pill in the small box to Lena. At that time, Lena had no way to refuse, so she reached out and took the pill. Under John's eager gaze, Lena had no choice but to use her body to test drugs like him. Lena hesitated. She did not know what would happen to herself if she took the spill into her stomach. Then Dr. John told her to keep an eye on her body for the next days to see if she had any strange symptoms, and then let him know. 3 days passed and Dr. John did not come to the research center. Lena was hanging around in the laboratory all day. But today he suddenly appeared out of nowhere, making Lena jump. Dr. John's eyes were sunken, his cheeks were thin, his appearance frightened Lena. He seemed a bit surprised when he knew that Lena's body did not react after taking the pill. He took some blood samples from her hand and examined them carefully. Seeing Dr. John's mental state at the time, Lena became a bit worried and felt that something was wrong with her. After observing for a long time, Dr. John suddenly banged the table very angrily. He didn't understand where he went wrong. After showing anger, suddenly Dr. John's body went into shock. His eyes widened suddenly and he seemed very uncomfortable in his body. He suddenly fell to his knees, vomiting a lot of blood. The scene was terrifying. The amount of blood he vomited was very large, which caused Lena to panic. She stood beside him for a long time without daring to move. After a while, Lena rushed over to help Dr. John up and said she would call an ambulance. But when he heard Lena about to call an ambulance, he immediately shouted at her. His reaction scared Lena because she had never seen Dr. John like this. Perhaps knowing that she was in a state of panic, Dr. John said he was fine. He told her by all means not to tell anyone. The next day when she entered the laboratory, Lena saw that the door was not locked. She thought that Dr. John had arrived early today. Suddenly, the scene in front of her startled her. Dr. John was holding a bag of blood and drinking it. He looked very thirsty. Hearing the sound, Dr. John quickly turned his head to look at her. His appearance was very scary. His mouth was covered with fresh blood. Dr. John was now staring at Lena with bloodshot eyes as if he had lost his eyes.
Human blood. Only human blood works. It's human blood.
Then he smiled strangely at her and said scary things. Not stopping there, he looked straight at Lena and said it would be like to test fresh human blood. So immediately he charged towards her with great ferocity. Lena then screamed and turned to run out. She was terribly scared. Then Lena's screams seemed to have brought Dr. John back to his senses. He stopped chasing her. However, Dr. John's condition was still terrifying. A pair of bloodshot eyes fixed on Lena. Suddenly he said that the experiment was successful. However, he couldn't control it. He told Lena to be careful.
It's a new step. Vampires will be back,
he said as he turned away. Even more frightening was that Lena also accidentally took that drug. Lena's whole body was shaking. She was confused if she would become like Dr. John. That was also the last time Lena saw Dr. John. But within a few days, many strange cases happened. The dead person was a young woman in a red shirt, believed to have been sucked to death. Since that case, tragedies like this have happened one after another. The victims were all girls in red. It was said that the killer targeted women who often went alone, and that murderer did not steal anything but only sucked human blood. After a few female corpses were drained of blood, the entire city was engulfed in an atmosphere of terror. It was rumored that vampires had appeared. It was said that they had seen vampires in a park near the outskirts of the city. An older man doing morning exercises saw a man holding a live rooster on the grass. His mouth was full of blood and he looked horrible. It was Dr. John. He had completely lost his mind and became a real vampire. Since then, no one had seen him again. But the legend of modern vampires had spread across the country. The research institute immediately shut down the case about Dr. John. After that, Lena also quit. Then Lena returned to her hometown to rest for a while, but did not expect the other pill to work for her. "So when did you start sucking blood?" Captain Lee looked at her with a serious expression. She said that was when she started researching Countess Dracula, as she was also affected by the drug. Countess Dracula was a powerful woman like Elizabeth Bathory. There were the demons that had sucked human blood since ancient times and used human blood to hold onto the beauty of youth. Captain Lee continued to ask Lena about her process of killing people to suck blood. And when it came to the blood-sucking process, Lena's tears welled up. She started to remember what happened. When she returned to her hometown, she stayed at home for a year. But during this time, her body also began to change. She became very bloodthirsty. Every time she saw blood, her heart burned. She desperately wanted to drink those drops of fresh blood. The bright red blood that looked so beautiful was like the most delicious delicacy in the world at this moment, tempting her. That intense bloodlust tormented her nerves every day, making her struggle a lot to suppress her thirst. It seemed that only the sensation of sucking blood into her mouth could make her feel alive. Unknowingly, she realized that she had become a vampire. Lena woke up with a start to find it was a terrible dream. A dream of being sucked into blood. That horrible dream appeared every night. Lena knew that the drug eventually had a side effect on her body, and she would also become a terrifying evil like Dr. John. That day, Lena tiredly went downstairs to eat with her mother. The strange thing was that since her body had a craving for blood, the food her mother usually cooked was like something difficult to swallow when she put it into her mouth. Every time she ate these normal meals, she felt very nauseous, had difficulty swallowing, and was always in a state of weakness. Finally, one day she couldn't take it anymore. As soon as the food entered her mouth, she felt very disgusted, so she rushed to the toilet. Lena vomited out all the food in her stomach. At that time, her mother thought that Lena might be pregnant, but thinking about it again, she couldn't be because her daughter had been in the house all the time. Lena couldn't tell her family about it, but she couldn't eat food. She knew that she could only rely on herself and could not depend on anyone else. She did her research about her condition. Unexpectedly in history, there was such a person called Elizabeth Bathory, a countess of Hungary in medieval Europe. She was called the Vampire and was an extremely scary character. At this point, Lena realized that Dr. John's so-called EB project was the English abbreviation of Countess Dracula, and the project was a secret study of human blood based on the true events, Dracula. According to the legend, the vampire Countess would use money and power to kill the handmaidens and peasant girls with the help of evil soldiers. She killed the girls because she was haunted by ancient magic. She believed that the blood of young girls would make her immortal and always young and beautiful. She took the fresh blood of the girls she had just killed as quickly as possible, drinking a large glass of blood every day. She even bathed regularly with the girls' blood, which she believed would make her skin youthful. Indeed, she was known as the first beauty of Europe. She had charmed countless young gentlemen. When she was in her 50s, there were still young knights fighting to snatch her. It was also said that the more than 600 young girls were killed, and all their bones piled up on the ground floor of a bathroom. After the Countess's death, her castle was haunted. So the Hungarian government sealed the castle to prevent people from coming near it. Lena finally understood that Dr. John was based on the events of the vampire countess, and he used the mysterious substance extracted from the blood as medicine to delay aging. But she didn't know why its side effect was turning humans into vampires. She knew she could not escape this misfortune, so she tried to suck the blood of animals in a basement to survive. At first, Because her body was very hungry, she felt very satisfied as soon as she sucked the blood of the animals. Those drops of blood were like a kind of elixir. It could make her body satisfied, even shaking with excitement. But once this sense of satisfaction passed, she felt she had truly become a complete demon, and gradually the blood of the little animals could no longer satisfy her. The human blood seemed to constantly give off an aura of seduction, seducing her. Sometimes she couldn't control her body anymore. The feeling of crazed bloodlust from within her body grew stronger and stronger. Many times she approached her mother unconsciously, wanting to bite and drink blood, almost uncontrollably. At this point, she knew that she couldn't stay at home anymore, or she would harm her mother. The desire to drink human blood caused her a lot of pain every day in the struggle between will and body. But animal blood could no longer satisfy herself. She desperately needed human blood. So she went to the city. Thanks to being a high-achieving medical student, she quickly found a job in a hospital. But her real purpose was to use her work to satisfy her desire to drink human blood. When people weren't paying attention, she would secretly go into the hospital's blood storage and steal the blood that the doctors prepared for the surgery. As she sucked human blood into her mouth, she felt such intense satisfaction that her whole body trembled again. But in the world, there was no secret action that was not exposed. After more than a year, her secret was suddenly discovered. While entering the warehouse to draw blood for surgery, a doctor accidentally saw a horrifying scene before his eyes. The doctor ran outside screaming in fear, and also, she knew that her days of drinking blood were over. She was kicked out of the hospital, and because of an internal announcement from the health system, she couldn't find work in this industry anywhere anymore. Walking on the busy street, she looked for blood everywhere. But she was a girl, unable to attack others to get blood, and she didn't dare to do it either. Just when she thought she would die like this, she suddenly found hope. She saw a child begging on the street, which caused her to come up with a terrible and evil plan. She walked up to the child and left some money for the child. Her actions made a good impression on the child. She won the child's trust and quickly brought the child home with a warm and kind smile. She took the child to a health check, bathed the child herself at home, and made nutritious food for him. But in the evening she gave the child sleeping pills, and while the child was fast asleep, she began to perform her behavior. She felt that she had truly become a demon, but she could not control her bloodlust. She used a knife to cut a line on the child's hand. This was the first time that blood had been directly drawn from a living person. This feeling was great for her, giving her an unprecedented sense of satisfaction, making her even more addicted to blood. Perhaps because of the pain, the sleeping child was startled awake. The child screamed when he saw Lena sucking his blood. The child was very strong. He pushed her to the ground and ran outside to find a way out. Lena knew that she couldn't let this child run away or her story might be exposed. So, she took a sharp knife and rushed towards the child and stabbed him in the stomach. The child fell to the ground in pain. He was almost dying. She was scared at first because she knew the consequences of murder anyway. But when she saw the blood slowly trickling out from under the child, her fear completely disappeared. In her eyes at that time, there were only pools of blood full of temptation. She stored and drank the child's blood for more than a month. During this time, every day she was very satisfied and excited. Fortunately, the child was a street child with no family, so no one cared about his disappearance. This case was never discovered. From then on, she often went looking for wandering children. She would also go to the orphanage to take the children for adoption, to force them to supply her with blood. So far, 3 boys had died in her hands. She also discovered that the blood of those teenagers could keep her young, so that she still looked like her 20s despite being in her 40s, so she couldn't stop sucking blood. Whatever the reason, you must accept the severe punishment of the law if you commit murder, Captain Lee said. After Modern Vampire Legend in 1995, another female vampire was also captured more than 20 years later. Suspect Lena sucked the blood of 9 children, of which 6 were blood slaves in her custody. The remaining 3 children were killed. Lena was sentenced to death in the first instance trial, executed that year. Boss, did the vampire that existed 20 years ago mysteriously disappear like that? How can a vampire disappear for no reason? Thought Captain Lee. To catch him, Captain Lee's team at that time sacrificed 2 people, but in the end the case fell into a deadlock. Captain Lee said that he would tell Leo about the story when he had a chance, and now both needed to eat a full meal.